Right. So this is walls, wires, tags, and trellises. And so it's an introduction to the support systems needed for training fruit trees in a heritage kitchen garden. So I'll give a brief overview of the structures used in the last three centuries in kitchen gardens generally, and then talk in more detail about the fruit tree training that's going on at Dyffryn Gardens where I work. So next slide, please. So the historical eras in Britain, I thought that as many of you from abroad, you might not be quite so savvy about some of the terms we use. So when we talk, the 17th century or the 1600s, and that was important in the UK because it's when the Huguenots came from France and Belgium, and they brought lots of craft skills with them, including fruit tree growing and training. So the 18th century is the Georgian era, and this was marked by the landscape movement where gardens moved towards informality. And for the kitchen gardens, they moved away from the house. Often 2 or 3 acre gardens were built, sometimes divided into a couple of gardens, perhaps a large one and a small one. Examples of this, Attingham or Audley End. Within the landscape movement, in the Georgian time, there was the Rococo movement, and this is a very decorative style, and it went through the whole of Europe, and that was 1730 to 1760. And so Victorian time in the 19th century was from 1838 to 1901. And it's often considered the heyday of kitchen gardening, and when it was most skilled, most sophisticated, and the most resources going into it. Then 1900 to 1910, really into 1914, was the Edwardian, or we refer it to the earlier 20th century. And this was the rise in the UK of the smaller kitchen garden for the new money who wanted to have what the old money aristocracy had. And it was about growing the best and the tastiest of the crops, and the combination of beauty and productivity in your kitchen garden. So it was a place where the garden owners would want to take their visitors to enjoy seeing the blossom in spring, the fruit developing and ripening for harvest. Next slide, please. All right, and the next slide, please. Thanks. So this is the kitchen garden at Kew Palace Kitchens. So Kew Palace was one of the homes to King George II and his family in the 1720s. And it was an informal retreat from them where they could escape from London. And then to where George III lived until his death in 1820s. The kitchens were closed following his death, but they've been recently restored and open to visitors. So a small kitchen garden has been created by the Palace Kitchens to give the visitors a snapshot of Georgian kitchen gardening. To quote from the Palace website, experience this little kitchen garden with neat vegetable beds laid out between gravel paths and fruit trees climbing the walls. This gives a flavour of what Georgian kitchen gardens were like. When they were in use, the real gardens were enormous and stood along Kew Road. As you can see here on the walls, the wooden system for training wall fruit. Wooden trellises hung on the garden walls from hooks fixed to the walls. And this meant that sometimes the wind could catch the trees and lift the trellis. It was popular on heated walls and also stone walls where the lines of mortar were more irregular. Though here the walls are brick and not heated. Could I have the next slide, please?
Sorry, it seems to have frozen. Ah, there we go. Has that come through okay?
It's not showing on mine. I don't know if it's showing on others, but my Oh, that's it. Oh, great.
I think it's a slow line to you.
Yeah, I think I've got something saying it's stable. So, right. Painswick, okay, gone. So if you didn't have walls in your kitchen garden, freestanding wooden fences could be built to create enclosure and train trees along. These trees are in the kitchen garden at Painswick Rococo Garden, which was originally built in the 1740s in Gloucestershire, where the productive garden is in the centre of the garden. The beds and paths are lined with 4-tier apple and pears trained along fences and made from wooden battens. The chicken wire you see is to keep the animals out from the veggie beds. This method was recommended in a book published in 1608 by Sir Hugh Platt, a writer and inventor of horticulture and agriculture, who wrote, "Instead of privy hedges about a quarter, I commend a fence made with lath or sticks, thinly placed and after graced with dwarf apple and plum trees spread broad upon the stick." Next slide, please. Are you seeing the other one now?
Yes.
Yeah. So you should have Attiam Park. So another method popular in the 18th century and first half of the 19th century was to attach the tree with twine or pieces of fabric to cast iron nails hammered into the mortar joints of the walls at 23-centimetre intervals. Every year the ties and some of the nails would be removed and the trees adjusted. Celia Fiennes, who travelled through England on horseback, 1685 to 1712, wrote, "The first garden is square, the walls full of trees, nailed neat, and apricot, peach, plum, and nectarine, and which spread, but not very high, and between each is a cherry." This is the wall at Attiam Park, taken in 2005, a few years before the restoration of the wall garden was started. The walls are Georgian, and although it was cultivated until the 1950s, the walls were never wired, as the family fortunes wavered in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As part of the restoration, the walls were wired, as training and fixing the trees using nails would have taken an enormous amount of a skilled gardener's time. Can I have the next slide, please? So another way was to fix circular eyes into the walls at irregular intervals. This is Tintsfield, near Bristol, where oblique cordon trees are tied into the wall via vine eyes. And the kitchen garden at Tinsfield dates back to 1860, and you can see this in nails as well. Next slide, please. So moving on to the late Victorians, the 1890s, this is Dyffryn. So from then onwards, the walls had fixings placed at ends and regular intervals along the walls and wires tensioned between them. After the idea came to Britain from France and Flanders in the 1870s. At Dyffryn here, a long metal straining bars was set into the walls and the wires tensioned by adjustable screw fixings. When the tree is planted, hazel rods, bamboo or wooden battens are tied to the wires and the tree tied to the rods as they grow. The angle of the rods are adjusted through the growing season to slow or increase the speed of growth to create a balanced tree. Once the framework has grown, the branches are tied directly to the wires. These are the copies of the 1894 straining bars, and they were reinstalled at Dyffryn about 6 years ago. This is the west side, the west-facing wall between the large vegetable garden and the fruit garden, which is the other side of the wall. And we planted them with sweet cherries and apricots. Next slide, please. So Dyffryn Gardens, the Edwardian. So this is the fruit garden at Dyffryn Gardens. Although predating the Edwardian garden design of much of the ornamental pleasure grounds at Dyffryn, the two kitchen gardens are being restored as an Edwardian kitchen garden. The house and the gardens were developed after being bought by the Corey family in 1893, a family who had made their fortune through the shipping and mining of coal in the South Welsh valleys. They are now listed as Grade 1 gardens and considered the best example of Edwardian garden design in Wales. In 1906, the family commissioned the landscape designer Thomas Mawson to develop the pleasure gardens. He saw the kitchen garden as a place where the garden owner would take their guests to enjoy the blossom in spring, watch the fruit growing through the summer and the ripening in autumn. He did some embellishments to the walls and created another entrance in the larger vegetable garden to join it to the pleasure gardens. So he saw it very much as integrated in the garden. The post and gardens details you see are taken from Thomas Marston's The Art and Craft of Garden Making. He recommended either metal posts fixed into the ground, or preferably oak posts with a wooden top rail and wires underneath to train the trees on. He also thought that posts should have a round or pointed newel post to prevent the rain seeping in. As when I started, we had a very, very limited budget, and we used soft wood fence posts. These do rot at the base ground, and we are planning to replace them with oak posts and metal covering the wood just above and below the ground level to stop the decay. Next slide, please. So I put this one of the new in because it was very much a modern, I felt it was a very modern reworking of a heritage kitchen garden. And the alternative method is, which I was very impressed here, was to see to fix a desired shape to the tree with the wooden strips, as Andy has talked in great detail about it was, and tie the tree in as it grows. And what I was taken was that it actually shows the visitor the future, and it created a very striking visual from the adjacent path as you walked around. And it introduced the visitor to what's coming when they go through the gate. It lures them in. Next slide, please. So talking about Gasbeek and really the perfect heritage kitchen garden. So in September 2016 and February 2017, I went to the Museum Garden Gasbeek in Flanders. So the garden was built by the Flemish Regional Government Department of Nature and Forests, a team led by Marcel Vossin, in 2006 to show the history and skills of Flemish kitchen gardening, with the emphasis on the late 19th century. The standard of horticulture is outstanding, with the training of fruit trees a speciality. And talking about the skills and developing the gardeners, Marcel Vossin actually grew up on a market garden. So he learned from his parents and his grandparents and how to do the fruit trees. And he himself started pruning fruit trees age 10. So here it's what I would call the continental way. The French and Belgian methods of wall wiring are shown, and they are similar to what the Newt has done. So when they had the walls built, they built into them with strong metal fixings shown at each end and at regular intervals along the wall to keep the wires close to the wall. They then used modern plastic wire as it would last longer, and they're stretched horizontally every 40 centimeters up the wall with tensioners at the end. Vertical hardwood battens have been fixed to the wires every 30 centimeters. And so they've actually drilled through the battens and threaded them onto the wires and then used other wires, as the Newt did, to hold them in place so they don't move. Then for the if you're doing curved and diagonal shapes, the desired shape of the tree is then mapped out in wire, which is fixed to the wooden battens. So as the trees grow, they are fixed to these wires, or if they're curved, if they are a vertical one, they can go straight to the battens. So the borders below the trees planted in is only 40 centimetres wide, and then there's the path. If it's wider than 40 centimetres, the tree will grow too vigorously and be difficult to control the vigour. And wiring the walls like this allows a great number of styles to be grown, especially the curve forms, which are very visually pleasing. The trees are also keep them well balanced and more uniform. And combined with a detailed pruning regime, they grow plentiful crops of very large but very tasty pears and apples, and they have very little disease. And so they obviously use the full-on Lorette system. Next slide, please. So all the tensioners, ties, and other fixings you need. So there are a number of different fixings for wall wiring depending on the time period. So starting from the top left and working around clockwise, the top left is actually the Victorian style vine eye that they decided to go with in Attingham. Then along from that, we have the newt with their modern vine eye mixed into the wall, and with the turnbuckle tensioners, which are good for adjusting and ensuring that the wires stay tight, as they will move over time. Next, we have the replacement late Victorian metal bars, and with an adjustable bolt and a square. We had a square nut on them, so we decided to go for that little detail on that. Then you have at Gasbeck, they went for the wire adjusters, and these are really good because you can keep on adjusting them over a long time. You don't run out of room to adjust them. Below that is the pair wall projection glass roof. So one wall, they had just put the little glass roofs on the top of the pairs, and then you see a hook below, and that's for hanging a linen curtain on. So during cold spells, when you knew frost was coming, you could hang the curtain, and that would protect the blossom, a young fruit, from frost damage. Then we actually have tying the tree to the wood or to the wires. So this was an ornamental, but it's been in Brussels Park, where they were still using the traditional way, using willow. This is obviously soft and will not damage young branches, and it's biodegradable, but it's a very skilled technique. I don't think many gardeners do it. At Gasbeck, they did use modern rubber or plastic ties onto the fruit trees, and that's quick and it will last a long time. I use tarred string because at the Trust we have a minimal use of non-biodegradables, and tarred string does last longer. I did use untreated jute string, and I was retying every year, sometimes twice a year, because we do have a very wet climate here. And also in the centre, don't forget drip irrigation. This is obviously a modern thing, but drip hose and leaky pipe is very good for concentrating the water in the root area. It wastes less water and reduces fungal diseases, and also saves a lot of time, which is something we're all trying to do. And it gives the even flow of water, which is especially important when the trees are young, and a good amount of vegetative growth is needed to create the framework. Next slide, please. So historical information. And so when deciding, obviously, how to restore the garden and what to put back, the decision helps of which method is fixing a best for the garden being restored. While at Dyffryn, we did have some wires. We could see some damaged original fixings from 1893, 94. It was great to actually see these. When I came to Dyffryn, I was told all the family and estate papers had been destroyed. These were the straining bar and wiring quotes for the kitchen gardens at Dyffryn, and which I've only found out about them several years after I started working in the gardens. The bars were installed by the glasshouse manufacturer Messenger, and the documents were found when somebody was doing, I think, research on the glasshouses in the archive of the Messenger glasshouses at the Museum of Rural Life in the University of Reading in England. Other photographs, documents have helped in the restoration of the kitchen gardens, and some photographs that were taken for a magazine in about 1910, and the surveyors and auctioneers' sales particulars from when the estate was sold in 1937. These are held at the Glamorgan archives. Local papers have often given us a lot of information about things that are happening, plantings, the employment of lady gardeners, what happened during the First World War, which was very defining for the gardens. And so the National Library of Wales has put a massive archive of local Welsh newspapers online, making a search a lot easier and quicker now than it used to be. The head gardener of the time also wrote a lot for local newspapers, and he gave an RHS journals and magazines as well. And so the RHS is of magazines and papers, and their library is a good source. Also, while Corey asked for his papers to be destroyed, the people he corresponded with didn't. And so a lot of correspondence of other gardens and garden owners have been kept, and certainly he had correspondence with the Hidcote, and their researchers have uncovered documents and research that has been used, especially plant lists. So I would always say to look around for secondary sources, and then they do come, and they are very useful. Next slide, please. So how is this all being applied at Dyffryn? This is the bothy wall, or the west-facing wall of the fruit garden. On the wall wiring particulars, it's described as a pear wall. Using money raised from produce sales, the straining bars were reinstated about 5 or 6 years ago. We also concrete flooring from a 1960 to 1990 glasshouse that was built by the council when they had the gardens before it went to National Trust. Unfortunately, the concrete base was left in when the beds were reinserted over the top. So we managed to have the lower bed, that concrete's been removed there, but we're not quite sure at the top. We think there's some bits left. This wall is very important for the visitor experience as they walk around the garden. They can see the wall when they look through the arch from the larger upper garden. So it kind of pulls them through. And then after seeing the styles and the high level of fruit tree training in the museum garden at Gasbeck, it's been decided to add the wooden battens, even though we have no idea that they were used in the UK. In Dyffryn, we don't think they were. We decided this because the aim of the Dyffryn Gardens overall for the Trust aim is to make it a centre for high horticulture in the area, well, in the country, and to have a real high visibility. So next slide, please. So this is the plan for the bothy border. And so we will work out the costing, and I decided to go for some curved shapes at each end, and then the palmette verrier. I chose this because the palmette verrier, it's easier to form a balanced shape. If you go for the W cordon, that's very difficult. I've done that in one small area, and it is quite demanding. We don't have the money to buy the palmette verriers or the W's in already trained like they did at the New. That would have been lovely, but we're going to have to go from the basics. And the cordon onde, the curved shape, the wiggly wave shape, I've not seen in gardens over here, so that would be something unique. So we're going to put battens every 30 centimeters and 3 meters long, and the battens will be 2 centimeter by 2 centimeter. And we're going to go for hardwood Iroko. And the wood, we were advised by the wood supplier that battens should be 2 centimeters by 2 centimeters, because anything thinner than that will not be stable over such a long length. So for the cordon onde, the wiring wave curve patterns will be added to the wooden battens. And for the palmate the verticals will be tied to the wooden battens. But as the garden is on a slope and the wires on a slope and they're angled with the slope, short horizontal battens will be fixed to the vertical battens for each tree at the U shape. And this will ensure that the tree would be balanced. If we didn't do this, there would be a tendency, I think, for them to move and shift, and then one side of the tree will grow more than the others. So we need 80 vertical battens, and then 14 90 centimeter ones and 14 30 centimeter ones for the horizontals. And that's been costed at approximately £2,000. So as we're spending all that money, so we're buying that, and then we'll have to rely on us or the DIY volunteers to drill the holes in their battens and thread them onto the wires and then fix in place. So we'll have to redo the wires. So we actually have, and this is sort of about the restoration, and obviously with somewhere like the Newt, they had a big amount, they're a commercial organisation, and they wanted it impact right at the beginning. For us, we've got no date to fix the trees and to buy the trees yet. So we'll probably, the DIY volunteers, we've got 2 very skilled DIY volunteers that we can be able to do this job for us. For the fixing of the battens, because I'm just fully occupied doing all the growing in the kitchen garden. And then hopefully they'll do that over this year, and then we'll have to order the trees, and then that will probably maybe a year, depending on whether they've got the fruit supplies, or buy them in as as maidens and train them over the next few years. Next slide, please. So in the conclusion, really, about what to go and what's appropriate for your garden. And as we've seen, not always what's there, what has previously been there. You have to decide what's important about your garden. And we talk often about spirit. In the Trust, we talk about spirit of place, and we also talk about layers in the garden. So we don't have to be slavishly in one time period. And so it's, what's the messages you wish to give to your garden? Is it bringing back horticulture, bringing back high horticulture? Is it just to get fruit and vegetables grown in the kitchen garden? And it's like also thinking about what adjustments you need to be made for the fruit growing to succeed, like Kate's decision with the curators to Attingham to wire the walls. And so also it's really important to think long term. At Gasbeck, they said their structures to last for 50 years. And that's why we're using the Iroko hardwood. And also, will there be enough skilled labour? We've all touched about this, to prune the trees for many years to come. Certainly we've been knocked, like Hilary, we've been knocked by the last few years. Once I started working here, and we eventually were able to have a seasonal person, but she was actually here for 20 months over 22 months. But then unfortunately that position went, we had hoped that we were going to be able to training up and she would become full-time permanent, but that's disappeared. So now I've actually been occupied a lot of the time in recovering the garden. Our volunteers as well were stopped for 15 months. I continued, so I was able to do the fruit tree pruning and keep them in shape. But it does, and also, do you need to do the whole garden, or we're concentrating on 2 walls where we put them back because those walls were in the best state as well. The other walls, those weeds growing out brambles, they need repointing, and there's been discussions about even a bit of whether one of the walls needs to be knocked down and rebuilt because it's leaning, but we certainly don't have the money for that at the moment. If you decide that you haven't got the resources to wire your walls and things, you can always go for 3D fruit growing. This is at Gasback here, and 4 different varieties have been trained around a goblet and a metal frame. And then more varieties have been grafted on in layers as the tree grows. In this way, 16 varieties can be grown on one structure in a relatively small area to give apples a supply of apples through the ripening months for several months to go. And it looks really, really effective. Okay, that's it.